way our lesson guide outlined this text that we're to look at is Jesus' blood sacrifice provided redemption once for all. Hebrews 9, 6 and 7, 11 through 22. And Jesus' better sacrifice takes away sin. Hebrews 10, 1 through 17. Another way of looking at that is that in Hebrews 9, Jesus is a high priest of a better tabernacle. Jesus is the high priest of a better tabernacle. In chapter 10, we'll talk about a better sacrifice. Jesus is the better sacrifice. So all those ideas kind of combine into what I looked at and where I got caught. Okay, if we take a look at Hebrews, yes, sir. He's the Genesis 14 king that Abraham paid tithes to. He was also a priest and a king. So that's why Jesus is like him. But other than that, we know very little about him. Okay, if we look at the book of Hebrews overall, it is written to a group of Jewish Christians who were tempted to either return to their Jewish roots of temple worship or practice of Judaism, or perhaps throw everything out altogether. Just abandon everything. At the time this book was written, the temple was probably still standing. So this temple ritual of sacrifice, the daily sacrifices, the annual Day of Atonement was still going on. And we know from the New Testament that some of the Jewish customs, those first century Jewish Christians still kept. You know, we have the story of Paul. He's cutting his hair to go and keep this vow, and other things like that. These Jewish Christians were facing a time of persecution. It was coming at them from their family, their Jewish family. It was also coming at them from the Romans, especially if they lived in Rome. So they were having a hard time. So the first 5 verses of Romans 9, you have a general outline of the tabernacle setup. When we move to verses 5 and 6, it talks about the priestly duties. The regular priest, including the high priest, day by day went into the holy place. They went into the holy place. They took care of the lampstand. They took care of placing the bread of the presence, or the show bread, upon the table on the Sabbath. They put incense on the altar. They did this daily. They went in there every day. In contrast to the second portion of the tabernacle, the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, only the high priest could go in there. Only the high priest. And he could only do this on one day out of the year. He could only go in there on the 10th day of the 7th month, according to Leviticus 16. And that was the month of Tishrei. That corresponds to our September, October. If you look at the dates of Yom Kippur from 2022 through 2024, you will see those dates fluctuate. For 2022, Yom Kippur was on 10/4 and 10/5. This year, it'll be on 9/24 and 9/25. In 2024, it'll be on 10/11 and 10/12. But that holiday is still very important to the Jewish folks. Notice that if you were to look at Leviticus 16, that I can read in there that he goes in there twice on that day. Jewish writers will say that he went in there as many as 4 times that day. And some commentators will say that Leviticus 16 verses 12 through 15 indicates he went in there 3 times. All I can see is 2, but that's me. But I'll tell you that other stuff is out there. The first time that he goes in there, in my way of thinking, is he takes blood from the bull that he has offered for himself and his family as the high priest. And he takes that blood in there, sprinkles it on the mercy seat, or the covering of the tabernacle, of the Ark of the Covenant. This goes back to Josh's lesson this morning, talking about propitiation. That was what that thing was called, the mercy seat. After he did this, he goes back out and he offers the goat or the ram for the people's sins. And he takes that blood in and he sprinkles that on the mercy seat. Now, what's between the Holy of Holies and the holy place? A veil, a curtain. And he goes through the veil, he comes out. But what's still blocked? What's still blocked? You still can't see in there. There is no access per se. The only access the people had to God per se was through the priest, the high priest. Got that? Access was through the priest. Now, one of the commentaries I was looking at made this point. You know, Exodus 19:16 says that all Israel was to be priests. So why didn't everybody have access? And then he goes on to say that ever since Adam fell into sin, humans and God were separated. And they needed a mediator to bridge the gap, or to help them find forgiveness, help them to restore that relationship. For the patriarchs, such as Abraham and Job, they were the mediators. They were the ones who talked to God. In the setup for the nation of Israel, the priests were the ones, especially the high priest, Aaron's family was the mediator. In the Christian system, and I guess that's the right word to use, I really don't like the term, Jesus came to be the better high priest. He allows us, because of his work, each individual can directly approach God. There doesn't have to be a human go-between now, per se. Jesus is still human, but he is the God-man. He is the one that we can approach God directly through. Other things about that Leviticus 16 thing is this high priest does not wear his normal priestly garb on that day. In a sense, he dresses down. He dresses in simple linen garments. No one else can be in the tabernacle that day when he is doing this ritual. And notice that it's sins committed in ignorance or unknowingly. And I'm not sure I've got this right. The sins that were known about were taken care of in the daily sin and trespass offerings? Maybe. Maybe not. But the sins done in ignorance were still sin. And where there is sin, the relationship between God and man is messed up. It needed to be restored. So, in the system that God established with Israel, the way of restoring that was the Day of Atonement. The high priest offered blood, offered the bull and the goat, and took the blood into the Holy of Holies. And the relationship was restored. But there's a problem with these, with this arrangement. It had to be repeated. It had to be repeated. So this is where we get to Jesus as the high priest of good things that have come. Jesus offers something better. The sacrifices that the priest offered were incomplete. They were temporary. And we could build on that idea that's placed other places in the book of Hebrews. The high priests themselves were temporary. Why? They died. But Jesus is better. He is better. He is resurrected from the dead and will not die again. So, Jesus' work is in the superior sanctuary. Okay? He had the sanctuary on the earth. It's quite elaborate, quite beautiful, made according to the instructions that Moses received on the mountain. But it is a copy or a shadow of what is the superior sanctuary in heaven itself. The sanctuary on earth, human made, is destructible. The one, heaven, heaven itself, is where Jesus went to make the atonement, the propitiation, not with the blood of bulls and goats, but with his own blood. And some of that stuff gets complicated. Why blood? It's kind of gross, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. 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 And if you could not hear what Michael said there, I'll try to summarize it a little bit. Blood is associated with life. And the penalty of sin, according to Romans, is death. The shedding of blood is a serious matter. A shedding of blood is a serious matter. Leviticus 17:11 talks about there is no remission without the shedding of blood. If you go back to Genesis chapter 9, when God is giving instructions to Noah about eating animals, you're not to eat blood because the life is in the blood. So life is in the blood. When there's no blood or when blood is shed, there is death. There is destruction. So this is why blood had to be the offering, or to cover for sin. A death had to occur to take care or to deal with sin. Now, that death can be one of two things. If you sin, you die. Or you have a substitute. So that's why this is kind of important. It's kind of difficult for us in our way of thinking to understand, but that's what it's all about. So Jesus works in the superior sanctuary, heaven itself. Notice that he entered once for all time. The priest, year after year, went through that veil to come out again. Through that veil to come out again. Jesus went in once. He made the sacrifice one time for all time. Yes, he took the veil away. Even at his crucifixion, that veil was torn in two, which symbolized that he was tearing that barrier between humans and God apart. Third, he sacrificed himself, as Mike pointed out, that it was Jesus functions as priest, he functions as sacrifice. He sacrificed himself, his own blood. It wasn't the blood of goats and calves. And think about these. The blood of goats and calves was imperfect because it wasn't a perfect human. It wasn't human. The blood of goats and calves is imperfect because it was involuntary. Those goats and those calves didn't volunteer to come up there and die. They had to be led in there and their throats were slit. They were repeated day by day, year by year, month by month. These sacrifices were repeated. Jesus brought about eternal redemption. And like I said, I went down a rabbit hole with verses 13 to 14. So there's an argument there from the greater, from the lesser to the greater. He talks about in those verses these parts. Let me find it. For if the blood of goats and bulls, with the sprinkling of the ashes of a heifer, sanctifies those who have been defiled, so their flesh is purified, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish, purify our conscience from dead works to worship the living God? So the blood bulls of goats sacrifices on the Day of Atonement. The red heifer is mentioned in Numbers 19, although it doesn't say red heifer here. Numbers 19, and by the way, if you were looking at certain newspapers, September the 22nd, 2022, 5 red heifers were delivered to Israel from a farmer in Texas, so that if ever they get in a position to build the third temple, they can purify the land. So know that that's important stuff, even today. So there was a ceremonial cleansing. The flesh was purified. And the argument is, how much more will the blood of Christ cleanse the conscience from dead works? Cleansing of the inner man. And what that actually means is where I got lost. I don't understand how that happens. Supposedly, it takes away the guilt of the sins in the past, or the guilt that we feel for our sins. It deals with that situation. Some of the stuff that Josh was talking about with his friends who were dealing with PTSD, wars. The conscience is a tool from God. It can be a guide, but it's got to be trained right. Okay. In the scriptures, we can talk about a seared conscience in 1 Timothy 4, verse 2. We can talk about a defiled conscience in Titus 1:15, an evil conscience in Hebrews 10:22. So the conscience can be hardened, it can be defiled, it can become evil. And maybe I can illustrate it this way. There is a criminal family in the United States named Bogle. Uh, they have a long criminal history. The family, long criminal history. Um, the one of the patriarchs of the family would take his young sons by the prison in Oregon and say, "Tell them someday you're going to live there." And to answer the question, did he ever live there? Yes, he did. Um, but they were trained to be criminals. So their conscience is bothered if they're not criminals. Does that make sense? Yeah. And you can read, I think the guy's name is Fox Butterworth. He's written a book called In My Father's House. I think about this things with this. But the conscience, the inner man, the Old Testament system dealt with just the outward appearance. But Jesus can deal with the inner problems. Now, when we think of that, uh, we talked about Jesus entering the holy place uh, with his own blood, that it's more effective than the animal blood. It's far reaching. It reaches the Old Testament, Old Covenant believer. It reaches the New Covenant believer. It's far reaching compared to what the animal sacrifices did. Inward, outward cleansing, both. It deals with the tool. It deals with the heart. It deals with the conscience. Now, there's a word play in this section of the scriptures with will and covenant. The same Greek word means both. A covenant is a serious agreement, often between two parties, one a lesser party, if you're using the Old Testament system of, say, like Abraham and God, and a will. A will is what you do with your stuff after you're gone. And he talks about that in this section that both sanctuaries were ratified by blood. Moses sprinkled blood on the people and on the tabernacle and on the book of the covenant, but it was animal blood. This animal blood that we've already talked about never completely takes away sin. It deals with it, make you ritually pure before God, makes you acceptable, but it's not complete. It's not complete. The complete comes in the Christ. Okay. So the Old Testament, or the old system, was only a shadow of good things to come. Shadows are important. Shadows tell you that there is a reality. But, and I'm going to use something I heard this morning, a guy talking about this. Do you want the shadow of the car, or do you want the car? Do you want the shadow of the house, or do you want the house? So the Old Testament system was a shadow pointing to Jesus. So it was better. The earthly lamb versus the heavenly lamb. The earthly lamb sacrifices were incomplete. The heavenly lamb is perfect. The worshiper can be complete. The old ones had to be repeated. This one took away sin. It was permanent. Jesus came to offer himself. That's Psalm 40, verses 6 through 8. And the Psalm 40 in your Old Testament's not going to read quite like this in here. Jesus is patient. It's permanent. Patient until his enemies become footstools. Now let's think about what that's saying. What's an enemy? Your footstool. Yeah, conquered. Under your foot. Get an idea of it. Joshua 10:24. Joshua conquers some kings. He has the leaders of the people to come and put their foot on the necks of those kings. Enemies, footstool. Enemies are completely conquered. Story of David. 1 Samuel 8, verse 2, where he lays out a group of people. One line of them he kills. No, two lines of them he kills, and then the next he allows to live. This is kind of the idea that you're looking at until he makes his enemies his footstool. And what's the last enemy? Death. Remember that. That's where I'm going to stop.